The stars stretched endlessly across the void, their faint shimmer like scattered diamonds on a black velvet canvas. The Terran ship Starlight moved silently through the darkness, its sleek silver hull reflecting the dim glow of distant celestial bodies. Ahead, Helios Station loomed, a vast, mechanical structure suspended in the emptiness of space. Its design was almost organic, with 5 curved arms radiating from a central hub, giving it the appearance of a metal flower blooming in the void. Lights flickered across its surface, creating an eerie, pulsating glow that seemed alive, almost watching. Inside the Starlight, Ambassador Ethan Carter stood by the observation window, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. His reflection stared back at him, a man burdened by the weight of impossible decisions. His sharp blue eyes betrayed the worry he tried to suppress, and the faint lines on his face spoke of sleepless nights spent preparing for this moment. The Draconians, a race of towering, reptilian beings with scales as dark as obsidian and eyes like molten gold, had already begun their campaign of terror. Their raids on human colonies had left devastation in their wake, and Ethan knew that this meeting was humanity's last chance to avoid a war it could not win. As the station grew larger in the window, Ethan's thoughts were interrupted by the sharp, deliberate footsteps of Captain Mia Turner. Her presence was commanding, her tall frame and steely gray eyes radiating an aura of calm authority. She stopped a few feet behind him, her tone clipped and efficient. "We picked up strange energy readings from the station," she said, her voice low but tense. "It's armed like a fortress, Ethan. And our long-range communications, they're being jammed." Ethan felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He turned to face her, his brow furrowed. "Jammed? Are you sure?" Mia nodded, her expression grim. "Positive. Whatever's happening here, it's deliberate. They don't want us calling for help." The words hung in the air like a shadow, dark and heavy. Ethan took a slow, steadying breath, but the unease in his chest only grew. Helios Station was supposed to be a neutral ground, a place for peace. Yet now, it felt more like a trap, a predator's lair, waiting to spring shut. As the Starlight began its docking sequence, the hum of the engines reverberated softly through the ship. The crew moved quickly, their voices hushed as if afraid to disturb the oppressive silence that seemed to surround them. Whispers passed between them, fragments of stories shared in low tones. "Have you heard about the Phantom ship?" one young officer murmured to another, his voice barely audible. "They say it appears when humanity is on the brink of destruction. Some kind of savior from the stars." The other officer scoffed, though his unease was clear. "Fairy tales. We can't rely on ghosts to save us." Ethan overheard the exchange but said nothing. He had no time for myths or legends. Yet, as he turned toward the command console, he caught sight of Olivia Hayes, the ship's chief engineer. She was seated at her station, her dark hair pulled back into a loose braid, her fingers moving rapidly across her tablet. There was a glimmer of curiosity in her hazel eyes, a spark of something Ethan couldn't quite place. "Legends often have a grain of truth," she said softly, almost to herself. Her voice carried a quiet conviction, as though she were speaking not from belief, but from knowledge. Ethan frowned. "You don't actually believe in that nonsense, do you?" Olivia glanced up, her expression thoughtful. "I don't know, Ambassador. But I do know that stories like this don't come from nowhere. Sometimes, they're just echoes of something real." Her words lingered in Ethan's mind as the docking clamps of Helios Station locked onto the Starlight with a metallic clang. The ship shuddered slightly, the vibrations running through the floor like an ominous heartbeat. Outside, the station's lights pulsed once more, casting long shadows across the docking bay. The air felt heavy, charged with an invisible tension that seemed to seep into every corner of the ship. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched not by cameras or sensors, but by something far older, far more dangerous. As the airlock hissed open, Ethan squared his shoulders and stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. He told himself it was just nerves, the weight of his responsibility pressing down on him. But deep down, a small, irrational part of him couldn't help but wonder, what if the whispers were true? What if something was out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to act? And what if that moment was now? The chamber where the peace talks were held was vast and cold, its walls made of smooth, dark metal that seemed to drink in the light. The room's design was stark and intimidating, with towering columns that reached up into a shadowed ceiling, as if the space itself sought to remind its occupants of their insignificance. Along the edges of the chamber, faint blue lights pulsed rhythmically, casting an otherworldly glow that flickered against the polished floor. In the center stood a long, black table, its surface so pristine it reflected the faces of those seated around it like a dark mirror. Ethan Carter sat at one end of the table, his hands resting uneasily on the cool surface. Across from him, the Draconian delegation loomed, their presence dominating the room. War Speaker Zaruk, their leader, sat at the head of their group. He was massive, his scaled body wrapped in ceremonial armor that gleamed like obsidian under the dim light. His golden eyes burned with an intensity that made Ethan's skin crawl. Every movement he made was deliberate, calculated, as though he were a predator studying his prey. The negotiations began with a tense formality. Zaruk's deep, gravelly voice filled the chamber as he spoke of peace, of coexistence, of the possibility of avoiding war. But his words felt hollow, like echoes in an empty hall. Ethan listened carefully, responding with measured diplomacy, but something about Zaruk's demeanor gnawed at him. The war speaker's gaze flickered often to a small device strapped to his wrist, a sleek, black band that seemed to pulse faintly with light. Zaruk's clawed fingers tapped it occasionally, almost absently, as if sending silent commands. Ethan's unease grew. He glanced at Captain Mia Turner, who stood silently near the chamber's entrance, her sharp eyes scanning the room. She gave him a slight nod, her expression grim. She felt it too, something was wrong. The tension in the room was suffocating, like the air itself had turned heavy. Ethan forced himself to focus, to push down the growing sense of dread that clawed at the edges of his mind. But before he could speak again, the silence was shattered. A piercing alarm blared through the station, its sound shrill and urgent, echoing off the chamber walls. The delegates froze, their heads snapping toward the source of the noise. Ethan's heart pounded as he rose to his feet, his eyes darting to the massive observation windows that lined one side of the room. Outside, the darkness of space was alive with movement. Hundreds of Draconian warships emerged from hyperspace, their sleek, angular forms cutting through the void like blades. The ships were black as night, their hulls glinting faintly under the station's lights. They moved in perfect formation, a swarm of death that seemed to stretch endlessly across the stars. The chamber erupted into chaos. Human delegates shouted in panic, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of fear. Ethan's blood ran cold as the realization hit him the peace talks had been a lie, a cruel deception. He turned to Zaruk, whose calm demeanor had twisted into a cruel smirk. The war speaker rose slowly, his towering frame casting a long shadow across the table. The talks were a ruse, Zaruk hissed, his voice dripping with malice. His golden eyes gleamed with triumph as he stared down at Ethan. Your colonies will fall. Surrender now, or we will destroy every human world. Before Ethan could respond, the chamber's main screen flickered to life. The image of Admiral Thorne, the Draconian fleet commander, filled the display. His face was harsh and angular, his scales reflecting the pale light of his ship's command center. His yellow eyes burned with the same cruel intensity as Zaruk's. "Your time is over, humans," Thorne sneered, his voice cold and sharp. "You have no chance against us. Watch as your fleet burns." Ethan turned back to the window, his stomach twisting in horror. Outside, the Draconian ships had already begun their assault. The human escort vessels, small and fragile in comparison, were being torn apart. Bright flashes of light lit up the darkness as one ship after another was obliterated, their debris scattering like ashes in the wind. The station trembled faintly with each distant explosion, a grim reminder of the destruction unfolding just beyond its walls. Mia's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and urgent. "We need to act now, Ethan. If they take out the station, we're next." But Ethan felt paralyzed, the weight of the moment crushing him. He had failed. The peace talks were a trap, and now humanity's last hope for survival was slipping through his fingers. It was Olivia Hayes who broke the spell. The chief engineer stood at a nearby console, her hands moving frantically across the controls. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with desperation, but there was a spark of determination there, a refusal to give up. "I have an idea," she said, her voice trembling but steady. "It's a long shot, but it might work." Ethan turned to her, grasping at the faint glimmer of hope in her words. "What is it?" Olivia hesitated for only a moment before speaking. "It's an old emergency code. My grandfather told me about it when I was a kid. He said it was used during the frontier wars, a signal to call for help when all seemed lost. Some people think it's just a myth, but..." She trailed off, her fingers hovering over the console. Ethan could see the doubt in her eyes, the fear that this was nothing more than a desperate gamble. But there was something else, too, a quiet belief that maybe, just maybe, the stories were true. "It's our last hope," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the alarms. Without waiting for permission, Olivia activated the code. A low, rhythmic pulse filled the chamber, resonating deep and slow like the heartbeat of the station itself. The sound was haunting, almost otherworldly, and it sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. For a moment, nothing happened. The chaos outside continued, the Draconian fleet closing in, the human ships falling one by one. But as the pulse echoed out into the void, Ethan felt a strange, inexplicable sense of calm. It was as if the universe itself was holding its breath, waiting. And then, in the distance, a faint light appeared. The silence that followed Olivia's desperate action was suffocating, like the deep breath before a scream. The rhythmic pulse of the emergency code reverberated faintly through the station, a sound both haunting and fragile, as if it might shatter under the weight of the chaos outside. Ethan stood frozen, his fists clenched at his sides, his mind racing through the grim possibilities. The Draconian fleet was closing in, their warships blotting out the stars beyond the observation windows. Each second stretched unbearably, the weight of impending doom pressing down on everyone in the room. Ethan's thoughts were dark and heavy. He could see no way out. The civilians aboard Helios station, scientists, diplomats, engineers, were all looking to him for salvation, but what could he offer them now? His voice, once steady and commanding, felt hollow in his throat. Surrender was the only option left, wasn't it? The alternative was annihilation. Just as he opened his mouth to speak, intending to offer humanity's submission to save the lives aboard the station, something changed. A faint, flickering light appeared on the far edge of the system, barely visible against the endless black of space. At first, it seemed insignificant, a distant star or a trick of the eye. But as the seconds ticked by, the light grew brighter, sharper, until it was unmistakably a single point of radiance cutting through the void. The room fell silent. Every pair of eyes turned to the windows, their fear momentarily replaced by confusion, then by a fragile, flickering hope. The light grew steadily larger, its glow cold and unyielding, until it resolved into a massive shape. It was a ship, but unlike anything Ethan or anyone else had ever seen. Its surface was impossibly smooth and black, as if it had been carved from the very fabric of the void. It absorbed the light around it, its edges blurring into the darkness, making it look less like a vessel and more like a shadow that had come alive. The size of the ship was staggering. It dwarfed even the largest Draconian warships, its presence oppressive and otherworldly. There were no visible weapons, no markings, no design that spoke of human or Draconian craftsmanship. It was sleek, featureless, and utterly alien, a phantom that had stepped out of legend and into reality. Admiral Thorne's face appeared once more on the station's main screen, his expression twisted with amusement. The Draconian commander's sharp teeth glinted as he laughed, a low, guttural sound that echoed cruelly through the chamber. "One ship," he sneered, his golden eyes gleaming with mockery. "You call this your savior? Against my fleet? Pathetic." But before anyone could respond, a voice rang out, deep and calm, cutting through the tension like a blade. It came from everywhere and nowhere at once, resonating through the station's comm systems with an eerie clarity. "This is Commander Liam Brooks of the Sentinel," the voice said, its tone steady and unyielding. "Withdraw your forces immediately, or face the consequences." The words sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. There was no arrogance in the voice, no desperation, only quiet certainty. It was the voice of someone who held absolute control, someone who had faced the abyss and emerged unscathed. The chamber fell silent once more, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone like a physical force. Admiral Thorne's sneer widened into a cruel grin. "You dare threaten me," he growled. "Very well. Let us see what your sentinel can do." With a wave of his clawed hand, Thorne gave the order. The Draconian fleet opened fire, unleashing a torrent of energy beams and missiles that lit up the void like a violent storm. The weapons streaked toward the Sentinel, their destructive power enough to obliterate entire cities. But the black ship did not move. It remained utterly still, a shadow against the chaos, as though it were mocking the Draconian assault. And then, impossibly, the weapons vanished. The energy beams dissolved into nothingness before they could reach the ship's hull, their light snuffed out as if swallowed by an invisible force. The missiles disintegrated mid-flight, their fragments scattering harmlessly into the void. The Sentinel finally moved, and when it did, it was like watching a predator strike. It was impossibly fast, its sleek form gliding through the Draconian fleet with a grace that defied understanding. It did not fire indiscriminately. Every strike was precise, calculated. Instead of destroying the enemy ships, it disabled them. Engines were shut down, weapons systems rendered useless, shields stripped away. The Sentinel fought not with brute force, but with an elegance that left its enemies helpless. On the starlight, the crew watched in stunned silence. The observation windows framed the battle like a surreal painting, the black ship cutting through the Draconian fleet like a knife through water. Olivia Hayes stood at the console, her hands trembling as she clutched its edges. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but in the stillness of the chamber, it carried. "It's not just fighting," she said, her hazel eyes wide with awe. "It's teaching them a lesson." Ethan turned to her, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Olivia swallowed hard, her gaze never leaving the windows. "It's not killing them. It's showing them how powerless they are. It's mercy, but also a warning. It's teaching them fear." The crew murmured in agreement, their voices filled with a mixture of wonder and disbelief. The Sentinel moved with a purpose that was almost surgical, dismantling the Draconian fleet piece by piece. It was as if the ship understood its enemies on a fundamental level, exploiting their weaknesses with a precision that no human or Draconian mind could match. Admiral Thorne's face appeared on the screen once more, but the arrogance was gone. His golden eyes were wide, his expression twisted with rage and fear. What are you?" he snarled, his voice trembling despite his efforts to maintain control. The Sentinel did not answer. It simply hovered in the void, silent and unyielding, as the last of the Draconian ships fell still. The once mighty fleet was now a collection of lifeless hulks, their crews stranded and defenseless. Ethan felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, awe, and a deep, lingering unease. The Sentinel had saved them, but its power was unlike anything he had ever seen. It was not human, not Draconian. It was something else entirely. Something ancient. Something terrifying. And as the black ship loomed in the darkness, its smooth, featureless surface reflecting nothing, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching them, too. The air aboard Helios Station was thick with tension, every breath a struggle against the oppressive weight of uncertainty. The Sentinel hovered in the void, its presence a silent sentinel against the chaos that threatened to engulf them. But the Draconians, relentless and fierce, were far from defeated. They regrouped, their warships forming a deadly ring around the station, a predator encircling its prey. Ethan watched from the observation windows, his heart pounding in his chest. The Draconian ships moved with a terrifying precision, their formation tightening, closing in for a coordinated assault. It was a maneuver born of desperation, driven by the fury of a fleet that refused to accept defeat. The air was electric with the anticipation of violence, the calm before the storm. Then, the Sentinel began to change. Its sleek, black hull shimmered under the cold light of distant stars, shifting and flowing like liquid metal. The transformation was mesmerizing, an eerie dance that defied the laws of physics. New shapes emerged from its surface: spires and turrets, sleek and deadly, bristling with power. It was as if the ship itself was alive, adapting to the threat, evolving before their very eyes. Streams of white energy arced from the Sentinel, curving through space with a grace that was almost organic. They moved like living creatures, twisting and turning, seeking out their targets with an intelligence that was both beautiful and terrifying. In seconds, dozens of Draconian ships were disabled, their engines silenced, their weapons rendered useless. The once formidable fleet was reduced to a collection of helpless husks, drifting aimlessly in the void. Admiral Thorne, his pride wounded and his fury unbridled, refused to surrender. His flagship, a monstrous vessel that dwarfed even the largest of his fleet, turned toward Helios Station. It was a last, desperate gamble, a decision born of madness. The ship accelerated, its massive bulk hurtling through space with the intent to destroy, to obliterate the station and everyone aboard it. Ethan's heart seized in his chest. He could feel the panic rising around him, the fear that threatened to consume them all. But the Sentinel moved with a speed that defied comprehension. It intercepted the flagship, its form phasing through the Draconian vessel as if it were nothing more than a shadow. For a moment, the two ships were one, their forms overlapping in a surreal union of light and darkness. Then, the flagship began to disintegrate. It happened silently, almost peacefully, as if the Sentinel had reached inside and undone the very fabric of its existence. The massive ship crumbled from within, its structure collapsing in on itself, dissolving into a cloud of debris that scattered across the void. Ethan and his crew stood in stunned silence, the reality of what they had witnessed settling over them like a shroud. The Sentinel was more than just advanced technology. It was something beyond their understanding, something that transcended the boundaries of science and reason. Mia Turner, her voice barely a whisper, echoed the thoughts that weighed heavily on them all. "It's not just advanced technology," she said, her eyes wide with awe and fear. "It's something else entirely." The crew nodded in agreement, their expressions a mix of wonder and disbelief. The Sentinel had saved them, had turned the tide of battle in a way that defied explanation. It was a force of nature, a guardian from the stars, wielding a power that was both miraculous and terrifying. As the last remnants of the Draconian fleet drifted powerless in the void, the Sentinel remained, its presence a silent reminder of the mysteries that lay beyond their understanding. And as Ethan gazed out into the darkness, he couldn't help but wonder what other secrets the universe held, waiting to be discovered. The battle was over, but the air aboard the Starlight remained heavy, charged with the aftershocks of what they had just witnessed. The crew moved in a daze, their minds struggling to process the surreal events that had unfolded before their eyes. The Sentinel loomed outside, a silent guardian in the void, its sleek, black hull reflecting nothing, absorbing everything. It was both a symbol of salvation and an enigma that defied comprehension. Ethan stood in the conference room, his thoughts a whirlwind of questions and unease. The room was dimly lit, the hum of the ship's systems the only sound as they waited. The crew members present, Olivia, Mia, and a few senior officers, were quiet, their expressions tense. They all knew this moment was significant, though none of them could predict what was to come. The door slid open with a soft hiss, and Commander Liam Brooks entered. His presence was commanding yet calm, his movements deliberate. He was tall, with sharp, weathered features that suggested a lifetime of burden. His uniform was simple, almost unremarkable, but his eyes held a weight that silenced the room. There was something about him, an aura of authority and mystery that made it impossible to look away. Brooks surveyed the room, his gaze lingering on each person as if he were measuring their worth. Finally, he spoke, his voice steady and deliberate, carrying a gravity that demanded attention. "My name is Commander Liam Brooks," he began, his tone low but resonant. "And I am here to tell you the truth." The room seemed to hold its breath. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the table, his knuckles white. He could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken questions pressing against the silence. "The Sentinel," Brooks continued, gesturing toward the massive ship visible through the observation window, "is one of 12. 12 ships created by humanity over 60 years ago, as part of a secret project known as the Aegis Initiative." A murmur rippled through the room, but Brooks raised a hand, silencing it. His expression was grave, his voice unwavering as he continued. "The Aegis Initiative was born out of fear," he said. "Fear that humanity would one day face an enemy we could not defeat. An enemy that would bring us to the brink of extinction. These ships were designed to be our last line of defense, using technology that bends the very laws of physics. Technology that no one outside the initiative has ever seen until now." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. The weight of Brooks's words settled over him like a shroud. He exchanged a glance with Olivia, whose face was pale, her eyes wide with disbelief. Mia sat rigid in her chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her lips pressed into a thin line. Brooks continued, his gaze fixed on Ethan. For decades, we've stayed hidden. We've watched from the shadows, intervening only when absolutely necessary. Because power like this, power that can reshape reality, is dangerous. In the wrong hands, it could destroy everything. His voice dropped slightly, and the room seemed to grow colder. But the draconian threat leaves us no choice. They will not stop. They will not negotiate. And if humanity is to survive, we must prepare for war. The word hung in the air, heavy and final. War. It was a concept that Ethan had always understood in the abstract, a distant possibility. But now, it was here, looming over them like a storm on the horizon. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat dry. "You're offering us your technology?" he asked, his voice quiet but steady. Brooks nodded, his expression unreadable. "Some of it," he said. "Enough to give you a fighting chance. But there are conditions." Ethan frowned, leaning forward. "What kind of conditions?" Brooks's gaze hardened, his voice firm. "This technology must never be used for conquest. It must never be used to oppress, to dominate, or to expand territory. It exists for one purpose and one purpose only, to protect humanity." His words were like a blade, sharp and unyielding. Ethan could feel the weight of them, the responsibility they carried. He looked around the room, at the faces of his crew, and saw the same mixture of awe and apprehension reflected in their eyes. They were being offered a gift, but it came with a price, a moral burden that could not be ignored. Mia broke the silence, her voice trembling slightly. "Why now?" she asked. "Why reveal yourselves after all this time?" Brooks's expression softened, just slightly. "Because we had no choice," he said. "The Draconians are more dangerous than you realize. Their fleet is only the beginning. If we don't act now, there won't be a future to protect." The room fell silent again, the weight of his words pressing down on them all. Ethan felt a knot tighten in his chest. He understood the gravity of the moment, the significance of what was being offered. This wasn't just about survival, it was about the future of humanity, about what kind of people they would become in the face of such power. Finally, Ethan stood, his gaze meeting Brooks's. "We accept," he said, his voice firm. "But know this, we won't misuse what you've given us. We'll fight, but we'll fight to protect, not to conquer." Brooks nodded, a flicker of approval in his eyes. "Then we have an understanding," he said. "And together, we'll ensure that humanity survives the storm that's coming." As the meeting ended, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The Sentinel had revealed itself, and with it, a truth that changed everything. The universe had grown larger, darker, and more mysterious. And as they prepared for the battles to come, Ethan knew one thing for certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The revelation of the Sentinel's true nature had left the crew of the Starlight reeling, their minds struggling to grasp the implications of what they had learned. The conference room was filled with a tense silence as Commander Brooks continued, his voice a steady anchor amidst the swirling storm of thoughts. Brooks's gaze was intense, his eyes reflecting the weight of his words. "This technology," he began, his voice grave, "changes everything. Once the galaxy becomes aware of what we possess, humanity will no longer be seen as vulnerable or insignificant. We will no longer be prey." His words hung in the air, a promise and a warning. Ethan felt the enormity of the situation settle over him like a heavy cloak. The room was charged with a mixture of fear and anticipation, the future suddenly uncertain and fraught with danger. Olivia, always the optimist, broke the silence with a hopeful note. Her voice was bright, cutting through the tension like a beacon. "Think of the possibilities," she said, her eyes alight with excitement. "Scientific advancement, new alliances, this could be a turning point for humanity." Her enthusiasm was infectious, a spark of hope in the darkness. But Mia, seated beside her, remained cautious. Her expression was guarded, her eyes shadowed by doubt. "Power like this," she murmured, her voice low and thoughtful, "always comes with a price." The room fell silent again, her words resonating with an undeniable truth. Power, especially of this magnitude, was never without consequence. It was a double-edged sword, capable of both great good and unimaginable harm. Brooks nodded, his expression somber. "That's why we need to work together," he said, his voice firm but tinged with urgency. "The Draconians are not finished. They are building 4 more fleets, each as large as the one we just faced. We have 6 months to prepare." The news hit the crew like a cold wave, the reality of their situation crystallizing in an instant. 6 months. It was a countdown to war, a race against time to ready themselves for the battles to come. The enormity of the task loomed large, a shadow over their thoughts. Ethan felt a knot form in his stomach, the pressure of leadership weighing heavily on his shoulders. He looked around the room, at the faces of his crew, each one a mix of determination and fear. They were his responsibility, his family, and he would do everything in his power to protect them. Olivia leaned forward, her eyes bright with resolve. "We can do this," she said, her voice steady. "We have to believe that we can." Her words were a lifeline, a reminder of the strength they held within them. But Mia's caution lingered, a reminder of the risks they faced. "We must be careful," she warned. "This is not just about winning a battle. It's about ensuring that the power we wield does not destroy us." Brooks listened, his expression thoughtful. "We will prepare," he said, his voice carrying a quiet determination. "And we will fight. But we must remain vigilant. Power can corrupt, and we must ensure that our actions are guided by wisdom and integrity." The room was silent, each person lost in their thoughts. The path ahead was fraught with danger and uncertainty, but it was a path they must walk together. They would face the storms to come, armed with the knowledge of the Sentinel and the strength of their unity. As the meeting ended, Ethan felt the weight of the moment settle over him. The future was uncertain, the road ahead filled with peril. But they were not alone. They had each other, and they had the promise of a power that could change the course of history. It was a daunting challenge, but it was one they would face together, with courage and hope. Back on Earth, the Colonial Council convened in a grand chamber that seemed to echo the weight of the decisions before them. The room was vast, its high ceilings adorned with intricate carvings of humanity's achievements, a reminder of their resilience and ambition. Yet now, those symbols felt hollow, overshadowed by the looming threat of extinction. Delegates from every colony sat in tense silence, their faces etched with worry and doubt. Commander Brooks stood at the center of the chamber, his presence commanding yet restrained. His words had sparked a firestorm of debate, his proposal to integrate Guardian technology into humanity's defenses dividing the Council. The Guardian's power was undeniable, but it was also terrifying, a force that could reshape the galaxy, for better or worse. Ethan sat among the Council, his heart pounding as he listened to the arguments swirling around him. Some delegates spoke of fear, their voices trembling as they described the risks of wielding such technology. "What if it falls into the wrong hands?" one asked, his tone sharp with apprehension. What if we become the very thing we're trying to fight? Others were more pragmatic, their voices calm but firm. The Draconians won't wait for us to decide, another countered. If we don't act now, we'll lose everything. Ethan's mind raced, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He could feel the tension in the room, the unspoken fear that bound them all. Humanity was at a crossroads, and the choice they made now would define their future. He stood, his hands gripping the edge of his desk as he prepared to speak. Enough. Ethan's voice cut through the noise, commanding attention. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to him. He took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping across the chamber. I understand your fears, he began, his tone steady but passionate. This technology is dangerous, yes. But it is also our only chance. He paused, letting his words sink in. The Draconians won't wait for us to debate. They won't give us time to weigh the risks. They are building fleets, 4 of them, each as large as the one we barely survived. If we don't act now, humanity will fall. And then it won't matter whether this power is dangerous, because there will be no one left to wield it. His words hung in the air, heavy with truth. Ethan's voice softened, his tone almost pleading. We have a chance to fight back. To protect our people. To show the galaxy that humanity will not be broken. But we can only do that if we work together, if we trust each other and trust ourselves. The room was silent, the delegates deep in thought. Ethan could see the conflict in their eyes, the battle between fear and hope. Finally, one of the senior members of the council stood, her expression resolute. You're right, she said, her voice firm. We can't afford to wait. Let's set this plan in motion. A ripple of agreement spread through the chamber, the tide turning in Ethan's favor. The council voted, and the decision was clear: humanity would embrace the Guardians' technology, using it to prepare for the battles to come. The next weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Engineers like Olivia worked tirelessly to reverse engineer the Sentinel systems, their minds racing to understand the alien technology that defied logic and reason. The labs were filled with the hum of machinery, the air thick with the smell of metal and ozone. Olivia's hands moved with precision, her mind focused on the task at hand. She knew the stakes, and she poured every ounce of her energy into her work. Meanwhile, diplomats traveled across the galaxy, seeking alliances with other species inspired by humanity's defiance. They spoke of unity, of standing together against the Draconian threat. Some species listened, their curiosity piqued by humanity's courage. Others were wary, their mistrust of the Guardians' power outweighing their fear of the Draconians. Ethan worked tirelessly, his days consumed by meetings and strategy sessions. He felt the weight of every decision, the pressure of knowing that the future of humanity rested on his shoulders. Yet he refused to falter, his determination driving him forward. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he also knew that they had no choice. As the plans took shape, a sense of hope began to spread. It was fragile, like the first light of dawn breaking through the darkness, but it was there. Humanity was no longer alone. They had the Guardians' power, the strength of their unity, and the promise of new allies. Together, they would face the storm, armed with the knowledge that they could endure, that they could fight, and that they could win. And as Ethan stood in the command center, gazing out at the stars, he felt a spark of hope ignite within him. The future was uncertain, the battles ahead daunting. But for the first time, he believed that humanity had a chance to survive, to thrive, and to prove that they were more than prey. They were fighters. Survivors. And they would not be broken. Ethan stood silently on the observation deck of the Starlight, his eyes fixed on the vast expanse of stars stretching endlessly before him. The Sentinel, that mysterious and powerful vessel, was now a distant speck of light, growing smaller and smaller as it drifted further into the unknown. Its departure left a strange emptiness in the void, as if the very fabric of space had shifted, leaving behind an invisible ripple that Ethan could almost feel in his chest. The silence was deafening, yet it carried a sense of finality. Ethan's thoughts swirled, torn between awe and apprehension. Humanity was no longer alone. The Sentinel had proven that much. They were no longer helpless, no longer prey to the predators lurking in the shadows of the galaxy. But with this newfound strength came the weight of responsibility, a burden that pressed heavily on his shoulders. He exhaled slowly, his breath fogging up the glass before him. The stars seemed different now, brighter somehow, yet also more ominous. Somewhere out there, the Draconians were regrouping, their fleets growing larger, their hatred for humanity burning hotter. They would return, and when they did, it would not be a simple skirmish. It would be war, a war for survival, for freedom, for the right to exist in a galaxy that had long seen humanity as insignificant. Ethan clenched his fists, his resolve hardening. This time, they would be ready. The Sentinel had given them more than just hope, it had given them the tools to fight back. But it wasn't just about weapons or technology. It was about unity. Humanity had been fractured for so long, divided by borders, by fears, by mistrust. Now, they had no choice but to stand together. If they faltered, if they let old wounds fester, they would fall. But if they could rise as one, they might just have a chance. Far away, in the cold reaches of the galaxy, something ancient began to stir. The other 11 Guardian ships, long dormant and silent, flickered to life. Their massive forms, hidden within the shadows of forgotten star systems, began to hum with energy. Their awakening was slow, deliberate, as if they were testing the waters of a galaxy that had changed in their absence. Each ship radiated an aura of immense power, their sleek, alien designs glowing faintly against the darkness. They were watchers, protectors, and perhaps something more. Their purpose was shrouded in mystery, their intentions unknowable. But now, for the first time in countless millennia, they were awake. And they were watching. Yet it was not only the Guardians who stirred. In the hidden corners of the galaxy, where light barely touched and time seemed to stand still, other forces began to take notice. Ancient beings, older than the stars themselves, turned their gaze toward humanity. They had watched civilizations rise and fall, their power unmatched, their wisdom vast. To them, humanity had been a fleeting curiosity, a species too young and fragile to matter. But now, with the Sentinel's awakening, humanity had become something more. Something dangerous. Something unpredictable. Whispers spread through the void, carried on the currents of dark energy that flowed between the stars. What would this new balance of power bring? Would it lead to unity or chaos? Creation or destruction? The galaxy held its breath, waiting to see what humanity would do with the fire it had been handed. Ethan didn't know what lay ahead, but he felt the weight of those unseen eyes upon him. He could almost sense the vast, unknowable forces shifting in the distance, their attention drawn to the small, fragile species that had dared to defy the odds. It was both exhilarating and terrifying, the knowledge that humanity's actions would now echo across the cosmos. The age of hiding is over, Ethan murmured to himself, his voice barely audible over the hum of the ship. He straightened, his gaze unwavering as he stared into the endless expanse. The age of humanity's ascension has begun. Behind him, the crew worked tirelessly, their determination a mirror of his own. Olivia was deep in the engineering bay, her hands moving with precision as she deciphered the secrets of the Sentinel's technology. Mia was coordinating with diplomats, her sharp mind navigating the delicate web of alliances that would be crucial in the days to come. Brooks was already planning their next move, his steady leadership a beacon of strength. They were not just preparing for war, they were preparing for a new era. An era where humanity would no longer cower in the shadows, no longer bow to the predators of the galaxy. They would rise, not as conquerors, but as survivors. As a species that had faced extinction and refused to yield. The stars seemed to shimmer brighter as if acknowledging this shift in destiny. Ethan allowed himself a small smile, a flicker of hope breaking through the storm of his thoughts. The road ahead would be long and treacherous, filled with challenges they could not yet imagine. But for the first time, humanity stood on the precipice of something greater. They were no longer just inhabitants of Earth. They were part of the galaxy now, a force to be reckoned with. And as the Sentinel vanished into the void, its light fading into the infinite black, Ethan whispered a silent promise to the stars. Whatever came next, humanity would face it together. They would endure. They would rise. And they would prove, once and for all, that they were worthy of the power they had been given.